The gunshot echoed across the valley as Grace Calloway lowered her rifle, the smoking barrel still warm against her palm. The deer collapsed in the distance, its fall muffled by the autumn grass of the Montana Territory. In 1874, a woman hunting alone was peculiar enough, but in the town of Whispering Pines, Grace was already an oddity, the barren schoolteacher who'd arrived 2 years ago with nothing but determination and a mysterious past. Grace slung the rifle over her shoulder and trudged toward her kill. At 27, she had learned to provide for herself, accepting early on that some women weren't meant for motherhood. The town doctor had confirmed it after her fever 3 years prior, his words still haunting her. "Your womb is damaged beyond repair, Miss Calloway. I'm afraid bearing children isn't in God's plan for you." The late afternoon sun cast long shadows as Grace approached the deer. She knelt beside it, whispering a quiet prayer of thanks before beginning the familiar process of field dressing her kill. The meat would feed her through the coming weeks, and the hide would fetch a fair price at Donovan's general store. That's mighty fine shooting for anyone, let alone a schoolmarm. Grace spun, knife in hand, to find a man on horseback watching her. Tall and broad-shouldered, he sat easy in his saddle, wearing a dusty brown hat pulled low over his eyes. His horse, a magnificent chestnut stallion, snorted and pawed at the ground. "Didn't mean to startle you, madam," he said, raising his hands slightly. "Vaughn Ashford. Just rode into these parts." Grace straightened, keeping her knife visible. "Miss Calloway, the schoolteacher in Whispering Pines. Schoolteacher by day, huntress by dusk?" Amusement colored his voice, but without mockery. "A woman alone needs to eat," Grace replied curtly. "Are you passing through or staying?" Vaughn dismounted in one fluid motion, revealing his considerable height. His movements reminded Grace of a mountain lion, deliberate and graceful despite his size. "Staying, if there's work. I've got away with horses and cattle. Heard the Tillman Ranch might be hiring." 5 miles west, Grace said, gesturing with her knife before returning to her task. "They lost 2 hands last month to a cattle rustling incident." Instead of moving on, Vaughn removed his gloves and stepped forward. "May I?" he asked, nodding toward the deer. Grace hesitated, then stepped aside. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, completing the field dressing in half the time it would have taken her. "You know your way around hunting," she observed. "Grew up in Wyoming Territory. Had to hunt before I could properly ride." His smile revealed a small dimple in his right cheek beneath several days' worth of stubble. "Let me help you get this back to town. It's getting dark." Grace's instinct was to refuse. She prided herself on self-sufficiency, but practicality won out. "I'd be obliged," she finally said. Vaughn hoisted the dressed deer onto his horse with ease. "Where's your mount?" "I walked. It's only a mile to my cabin." He frowned. "You walked out here and planned to drag a deer back alone?" "I've done it before," Grace said defensively. Vaughn shook his head in apparent disbelief. "Madam, you're either the most capable woman I've ever met or the most stubborn." "I've been called both," Grace replied, the corner of her mouth lifting slightly. They walked side by side as twilight deepened around them, the horse following obediently. Vaughn asked questions about the town, who was fair, who to avoid, where to find decent whiskey and a hot bath. "The Silver Dollar's got clean rooms and fair prices," Grace told him. "Mrs. Wilkins runs it. She doesn't tolerate foolishness, but she serves the best stew this side of the Mississippi." "And what about you, Miss Calloway? What brought a lady with your skills to a small town like this?" Grace stiffened. "I teach children their letters and numbers. That's all anyone needs to know." He nodded, respecting her boundary. "Fair enough." When they reached her small cabin at the edge of town, Grace expected him to simply help her hang the deer and be on his way. Instead, Vaughn efficiently strung up the carcass on her porch beam, built up her fire, and began helping with the butchering process. You don't have to stay, Grace said, uncomfortable with his prolonged presence. Few men had ever set foot in her cabin. My pa would haunt me if I left a lady to finish this alone when I had two good hands to help, he replied, his knife moving deftly through muscle and sinew. Besides, I haven't had a proper conversation in weeks of riding. Despite her reservations, Grace found herself warming to Vaughn's presence. His stories of driving cattle across the Wyoming plains and breaking wild mustangs flowed easily, and he seemed genuinely interested in her tales of difficult students and the challenges of teaching in a frontier town. By the time they finished packaging the meat, stars blanketed the sky. Grace wrapped several choice cuts in paper. "For your trouble," she said, offering them to him. Vaughn smiled, the firelight catching his green eyes. "Much appreciated, Miss Calloway. Perhaps I could repay you with dinner tomorrow. If I get hired at Tillman's, I'll be celebrating. If not, I'll be drowning my sorrows. Either way, I'd welcome the company." Grace studied him. At 32, Vaughn Ashford was handsome in a rugged way, with laugh lines at the corners of his eyes and a quiet confidence that didn't demand attention. Still, she'd learned long ago that attachments led to disappointment. "I don't socialize much, Mr. Ashford. Just dinner," he said, "as thanks for directing me to potential work." Grace hesitated before nodding once. "Very well. 6 o'clock at the Silver Dollar." After he left, Grace sat by her fire, wondering why she'd accepted. Perhaps it was the loneliness of winter approaching, or simply the novelty of someone who seemed to see her as more than the odd, barren schoolteacher who kept to herself. Either way, she told herself firmly, it was just dinner, nothing more. The next day at school, Grace found herself distracted. 12-year-old Emma Foster had to ask twice about her arithmetic problem, and little Timothy Watson managed to set his slate pencil on fire, while Grace's thoughts wandered to green eyes and a dimpled smile. "Miss Calloway seems sweet on someone," whispered Abigail Turner to her seatmate, loud enough for Grace to hear. Grace straightened her spine. "Abigail Turner, since you have time for gossip, perhaps you have time to recite the state capitals for the class?" The afternoon dragged, and when school finally dismissed, Grace hurried home to wash away the chalk dust and change her dress. She rarely wore her blue gown, saving it for special occasions, but something prompted her to remove it from its wrappings. The color brought out the amber flecks in her hazel eyes, and the cut, while modest, flattered her slender figure. She was pinning up her chestnut hair when a knock came at her door. Opening it, she found Vaughn standing on her porch, freshly shaved and wearing a clean shirt under his vest. "I thought we were meeting at the Silver Dollar," Grace said, surprised. "A gentleman escorts a lady to dinner," Vaughn replied. "And I have good news. Got hired at Tillman's, starting tomorrow." "Congratulations," Grace said, genuinely pleased for him. "Let me get my shawl." The Silver Dollar was busy with the dinner crowd, but Mrs. Wilkins had a corner table waiting. Several townspeople nodded to Grace, their curious glances darting between her and Vaughn. It had been nearly a year since she'd dined in public with anyone, let alone a man. "The town's mighty interested in our dinner," Vaughn observed quietly. "Small towns thrive on gossip," Grace replied. "By morning, half will think we're courting, and the other half will be scandalized by my boldness." Vaughn laughed, a rich sound that drew even more attention. And which half would be right? Before Grace could answer, Mayor Blanchard stopped by their table. "Miss Calloway, good evening. I see you're entertaining our newest resident." Grace introduced them, noting the mayor's assessing gaze as he shook Vaughn's hand. "We're always pleased to have skilled ranch hands in the area," the mayor said. "Though I must say, it's even more pleasing to see our dedicated schoolteacher enjoying some company. She works too hard, Mr. Ashford." "Seems to me a community that educates its children properly is investing in its future," Vaughn replied. "You're fortunate to have her." The mayor nodded approvingly before moving on. When he was out of earshot, Vaughn leaned closer. Is he always that proprietary about the townspeople? Mayor Blanchard takes a personal interest in everyone's business, Grace said, especially unmarried women of a certain age. And how do you feel about that interest? Grace sipped her water. I appreciate the community's concern, even when it borders on intrusion. When I first arrived, Mrs. Wilkins brought me soup every Wednesday for a month. Sheriff Dawson still checks my woodpile before winter. It's their way of caring. Their food arrived venison stew with fresh bread, and the conversation shifted to lighter topics. Vaughn described the Tillman Ranch and his duties breaking horses, while Grace shared amusing stories about her students' antics. It was the most pleasant evening Grace had experienced in years. Vaughn was attentive but not overbearing, and she found herself relaxing in his company. When he escorted her home under a canopy of stars, Grace felt a forgotten flutter in her chest. At her door, Vaughn removed his hat. I enjoyed tonight, Miss Calloway. As did I, she admitted. And after sharing dinner, perhaps you should call me Grace. Grace, he repeated as if tasting the word. It suits you. I hope we might do this again. I'd like that, she said, surprising herself with her honesty. He smiled, that endearing dimple appearing. I'll be busy at the ranch, but perhaps I could call on you Sunday after church? Grace nodded. I'd welcome the company. After a respectful tip of his hat, Vaughn departed, leaving Grace with the unfamiliar sensation of anticipation warming her chest. The next few weeks established a pattern. Vaughn worked dawn to dusk at the Tillman Ranch, but rode into town every Sunday to attend church and spend the afternoon with Grace. They shared meals, took walks along the creek, and gradually, Grace found herself sharing parts of her past she'd kept hidden. On a crisp November afternoon, they sat by the creek, watching fallen leaves dance on the current. Grace had just finished telling Vaughn about her childhood in Boston, where her father had been a professor before tuberculosis claimed both her parents. So you came west to escape the memories? Vaughn asked. Grace pulled her shawl tighter. Partly. I had teaching experience and heard frontier towns were desperate for educated women willing to instruct children, but mostly, she hesitated, uncertain whether to continue. You can tell me anything, Grace, Vaughn said quietly, or nothing at all. Your choice. His understanding loosened something in her chest. I was engaged, back east. Harrison was a banker's son with political ambitions. When the fever left me unable to bear children, he broke our engagement. Said a man in his position needed heirs. Vaughn's jaw tightened. Sounds like a fool who didn't deserve you. It was practical, Grace said, though the old hurt still lingered. A barren wife is a disappointment to most men. Is that what you believe? Vaughn's voice was gentle but firm. That your worth as a woman is tied to your ability to bear children? Grace looked away. It's not what I believe. It's what society believes. Why do you think the town gossips about me? Poor Miss Calloway, married to her schoolbooks because no man would want a wife who can't give him children. Vaughn reached for her hand, his calloused palm warm against her skin. Any man worth his salt knows a woman's value goes far beyond motherhood. You're intelligent, brave, kind to those children you teach. That's worth more than some biological function. Tears stung Grace's eyes. No one had ever spoken to her like this. It's kind of you to say. It's not kindness, Grace, it's truth. His thumb traced circles on her hand. I've known plenty of people who had no business being parents, and plenty of wonderful folks who couldn't have their own. Family isn't always about blood. Something in his tone made Grace look up. You sound like you speak from experience. Vaughn nodded, his gaze distant. My sister died in childbirth 3 years ago. Her husband couldn't bear to look at the baby, said she reminded him too much of my sister. So I raised little Mary until my brother-in-law remarried. His new wife is good to her, but... He swallowed hard. Mary still calls me Papa in her letters. Grace squeezed his hand. You must miss her terribly. Every day, he admitted. That's partly why I drifted here. Needed a fresh start somewhere. They sat in companionable silence until the setting sun painted the horizon in fiery hues. As they walked back to town, their hands remained linked, a bridge forming between their separate pains. That evening marked a turning point. Over the following weeks, their Sunday afternoons expanded to include Saturday evenings. When the first snow fell in early December, Vaughn surprised Grace by arriving at the schoolhouse with a sleigh borrowed from the Tillman ranch. Mr. Tillman sends his regards, Vaughn said as the children exclaimed over the sleigh and matching gray horses. And his permission to take the prettiest schoolteacher in Montana for a ride. The children giggled as Grace blushed. I need to clean up the classroom first. We'll help, Miss Calloway. Several students volunteered, suddenly eager to erase blackboards and arrange books. Within minutes, the classroom was tidier than it had been all term. Grace bundled up in her coat and muffler, allowing Vaughn to lift her into the sleigh as her students watched with undisguised interest. They'll be telling their parents about this before they even get home, Grace murmured as Vaughn flicked the reins. Good, he replied with a wink. Saves me the trouble of announcing my intentions. Grace's heart skipped. And what intentions might those be, Mr. Ashford? To court the most remarkable woman I've ever met, he said simply. If she'll have me. The sleigh glided through town, past curious onlookers and smiling neighbors. Grace was acutely aware of the public nature of this declaration. Vaughn was making it clear to everyone that his interest in her was serious. People will talk, she said quietly. Let them, Vaughn replied. I've never cared much for others' opinions when my own heart speaks clearly. They rode into the countryside, the sleigh runners cutting smooth tracks through fresh snow. Pine trees heavy with white dust lined the trail, and their breath formed clouds in the crisp air. Far from town, Vaughn stopped in a clearing and produced a thermos of hot coffee and a basket with bread and cheese. You planned this, Grace said, accepting the warm cup gratefully. Been planning it since the first snowflake fell, he admitted, though I didn't expect such an audience for our departure. Grace laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. The children adore you. Timothy asked yesterday if you might come teach the boys how to track animals in spring. I'd like that, Vaughn said. I like the idea of putting down roots here. His eyes held hers, and Grace recognized the question in them. She'd kept people at arm's length for so long, protecting herself from further hurt. But Vaughn had slipped past her defenses, showing her that her worth wasn't defined by what her body couldn't do. I'd like that too, she finally said. You putting down roots here. Vaughn's smile could have melted the snow around them. Grace Calloway, may I court you properly? With your permission, I'd like to call on you regularly, not just weekends. Yes, she said, the word emerging breathless and certain. I'd like that very much. When he kissed her, gentle and reverent beneath the winter sky, Grace felt something broken inside her begin to heal. Winter in Montana was harsh, but that year it passed in a blur of warmth for Grace. Vaughn proved to be a dedicated suitor, riding into town 3 evenings a week regardless of weather. He chopped firewood for her cabin, escorted her to church socials, and endeared himself to her students by organizing a Christmas pageant complete with a real manger and lambs borrowed from a nearby farm. By February, it was common knowledge in Whispering Pines that Vaughn Ashford was sweet on the schoolteacher, and most approved of the match. Mrs. Wilkins declared him a man of substance, while Sheriff Dawson noted he'd never had cause to throw him in jail, which is recommendation enough. Only Dr. Morris expressed concern, pulling Grace aside after a town meeting. Miss Calloway, forgive my intrusion, but as your physician, I feel obligated to ask if you've informed Mr. Ashford of your condition. Grace stiffened. My personal matters are just that, doctor. Personal. A man expects certain things from marriage, the doctor pressed. It would be unfair. Mr. Ashford is fully aware of my inability to bear children, Grace interrupted, her voice low but firm. And I would appreciate your medical discretion on the matter. The doctor looked surprised but nodded. Of course. I simply wouldn't want to see either of you hurt. Your concern is noted, Grace said, turning away before he could see the flush of anger on her cheeks. That evening, when Vaughn arrived for dinner, Grace was still unsettled by the encounter. As they sat by the fire after their meal, he noticed her distraction. Something's troubling you, he observed, taking her hand. Want to share it? Grace hesitated, then related the conversation with Dr. Morris. It just reminded me that no matter how much I might wish otherwise, I'll never be able to give you children of your own. Vaughn's expression darkened. That doctor should mind his own business. He meant well. No, Vaughn interrupted. He assumed I'm like other men who measure a woman's worth by her ability to breed. I'm not. He moved to kneel before her chair, taking both her hands in his. Grace, when I look at you, I see my future. I see intelligent conversations by firelight, adventures in the mountains, a partner to share my days. If children come into our lives, there are plenty who need homes, and if not, you're more than enough for me. Tears spilled down Grace's cheeks. How did I find you? I think we found each other, Vaughn said, reaching up to brush away her tears. And I thank God for it every day. As winter melted into spring, their courtship blossomed. Vaughn proved himself not just to Grace, but to the entire community. When the creek flooded in April, he organized the ranch hands to help reinforce the bridges. When influenza swept through town in May, he delivered food and medicine to quarantined families. By June, he had saved enough to put a down payment on a small property at the edge of town 10 acres, with a sturdy cabin and room for horses. Mr. Tillman, impressed with Vaughn's work, offered him a partnership tract that would allow him to work his own land while still earning from the larger ranch operations. On a warm evening, as fireflies danced in the twilight, Vaughn took Grace to see the property. The cabin needed work, but the bones were good, and the land stretched toward the mountains with a creek cutting through one corner. It's beautiful, Grace said, imagining gardens and perhaps a few goats or chickens. It needs a woman's touch, Vaughn replied, watching her carefully. And a lot of hard work. Grace turned to find him on one knee, holding a small wooden box. Inside nestled a simple gold band with a single pearl. Grace Calloway, you've brought light back into my life when I thought I'd just be drifting forever. I love your strength, your kindness, your fierce intelligence. I love the way you stand up for yourself and others. I love how you see beyond what the world expects to what could be. He took a deep breath. Will you marry me? Will you build a life with me here? Grace's heart soared. Yes, she whispered. Then louder. Yes, Vaughn Ashford. I will marry you. As he slipped the ring onto her finger, she added, But I'm keeping my job. The children need me. Vaughn laughed, standing to embrace her. I wouldn't have it any other way. Our children will have the smartest mother in the territory. Grace stilled in his arms. Our children? If you want, he said softly, there are always children who need homes. Or we can be just us. Either way, we'll be a family. Grace kissed him, pouring all her love and gratitude into the gesture. For the first time in years, she felt whole not despite what she lacked, but because of everything she had found. The town buzzed with excitement when they announced their engagement. Mayor Blanchard insisted on hosting the wedding at his large home, and the women formed committees to handle decorations, food, and music. Even Dr. Morris offered congratulations, though Grace detected a hint of skepticism in his eyes. Only once did Grace face direct confrontation about her condition. Widow Patterson, known for her sharp tongue, cornered her after church. "It's a shame to trap a virile young man like Vaughn with a barren wife," she said, voice dripping with false sympathy. "Men need sons to carry on their name." Before Grace could respond, Mrs. Wilkins appeared beside her. "What men need, Hester Patterson, is a good woman who loves them. Something your late husband sorely lacked, if his frequent visits to my establishment for comfort were any indication." The widow gasped and hurried away, leaving Grace staring at the innkeeper in surprise. "You shouldn't have to defend your happiness," Mrs. Wilkins said firmly, "and that woman needs to mind her own business." "Thank you," Grace said, touched by the support. Mrs. Wilkins patted her arm. "When my Henry and I couldn't have children, we made our legacy, built something lasting together. You and Vaughn will find your way too." The wedding took place on a perfect July afternoon. The mayor's garden overflowed with wildflowers, and the entire town turned out to witness the ceremony. Grace wore a cream-colored gown with lace that Mrs. Tillman had insisted on ordering from Denver, and carried a bouquet of mountain lilies that Vaughn had gathered at dawn. As they spoke their vows beneath an arch of roses, Grace felt a sense of rightness settle over her. This man who saw her as complete just as she was had rewritten her understanding of love and family. The celebration lasted well into the night, with dancing and feasting under lantern light. When they finally departed for their new home, townsfolk showered them with wheat kernels and good wishes. Married life suited them. Each morning, Grace would rise early to prepare for school, while Vaughn tended the animals they'd acquired: 2 horses, a milk cow, and a flock of chickens that multiplied with alarming speed. In the evenings, they'd work on improvements to the cabin, adding a second bedroom, just in case, as Vaughn put it, though neither pressed the issue of adoption immediately. By Christmas, they had settled into a comfortable routine. The cabin boasted new curtains, a larger kitchen, and bookshelves filled with volumes from Grace's collection, and new ones Vaughn ordered from back east. They hosted the school Christmas party, delighting the children with candy and small wooden toys Vaughn had carved. It was a season of contentment, marred only by occasional bouts of melancholy when Grace would find herself watching mothers with their children in town. Vaughn always seemed to sense these moments, drawing her close and reminding her of all they had to be grateful for. In late January, a blizzard struck with little warning. Grace had just dismissed school early when the storm intensified, forcing several children and their parents to shelter in the schoolhouse overnight. Vaughn battled through the whiteout to bring blankets and food, earning the eternal gratitude of worried parents. The next morning, as they trudged home through snowdrifts, Grace was struck by how naturally Vaughn had cared for the stranded children, telling stories, organizing games, ensuring everyone had enough to eat. "You're wonderful with children," she observed as they finally reached their cabin. "It seems unfair that you're married to someone who can't give you any." Vaughn removed his snow-covered coat and turned to her, his expression serious. "Grace, I need you to hear me. I married you. Not some future possibility of children. You." He pulled her into his arms. "You're not lacking anything. You're my wife, my partner, my treasure." The word struck something in Grace's heart. "Treasure?" "Yes," he said, cupping her face in his hands. "More valuable than gold or silver or any fortune a man could amass. You're the treasure I never expected to find, and I thank God every day that I wandered into your hunting grounds." Grace melted into his embrace, letting his words wash away the lingering doubts. "I love you, Vaughn Ashford." "And I love you, Grace Ashford," he replied, sealing the declaration with a kiss. February brought unusually mild weather, allowing them to start spring preparations early. Grace found herself uncharacteristically tired, falling asleep over her lesson plans and napping on weekends. She attributed it to the busy school term and additional sewing she'd taken on to help pay for a new stove. When March arrived with morning sickness, Grace initially blamed bad preserves, but after a week of constant nausea, a pattern emerged that she couldn't ignore. Impossible, she whispered to her reflection one morning after Vaughn had left for the ranch. Her courses had been irregular since her illness, sometimes absent for months, but she'd been assured childbearing was impossible. Still, the symptoms persisted. By the third week of March, she gathered her courage and visited Dr. Morris. The physician's examination was thorough, his expression shifting from professional detachment to disbelief as he completed his assessment. "Miss Calloway, Mrs. Ashford," he corrected himself. "I don't know how to explain this, but you appear to be with child, approximately 3 months along, by my estimation." Grace stared at him. "That's not possible. You told me yourself—" "I know what I told you," he interrupted, genuinely perplexed. "Based on the damage from your fever, conception should have been impossible. Yet here you are." He shook his head. "Medical science doesn't have all the answers, Mrs. Ashford. Sometimes the body finds a way that defies explanation." Grace pressed a hand to her still flat stomach, overwhelmed. "You're certain?" "As certain as I can be without modern hospital equipment," he confirmed. "The child appears to be developing normally. You should expect delivery in late August or early September." Grace left the doctor's office in a daze, her mind racing. A child. Their child. Something she'd resigned herself to never experiencing. How would Vaughn react? Would he believe it was a miracle, or suspect she'd somehow deceived him about her condition? She spent the day in a fog, mechanically teaching her lessons while her thoughts spun with possibilities. By the time she arrived home, she'd resolved to tell Vaughn immediately. He returned at dusk, tired from a day breaking new horses but brightening at the sight of her. "Something smells delicious," he said, hanging his hat and pulling her into an embrace. Grace had prepared his favorite stew, hoping good food might cushion the shocking news. They ate together as usual, Vaughn recounting his day while Grace listened, trying to find the right moment. Finally, as they sat by the fire with coffee, Grace set down her cup. "Vaughn, I saw Dr. Morris today." Concern immediately crossed his face. "Are you ill? You've been tired lately." "Not ill," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm with child. Our child." Vaughn went completely still, his cup frozen halfway to his mouth. "What did you say?" "I'm going to have a baby," Grace repeated, watching his face carefully. "Dr. Morris says it's impossible given my condition, yet it's happening." The cup slipped from Vaughn's fingers, coffee spilling across the floor unnoticed. "A baby? Our baby?" Grace nodded, tears forming. "I know it's hard to believe." She didn't finish because Vaughn had dropped to his knees before her, gathering her hands in his. "Grace," he said, his voice choked with emotion. I don't have words." "You're not angry?" she asked hesitantly. "You don't think I lied about angry?" Vaughn looked shocked at the suggestion. "Grace, how could I be angry about a miracle? I knew you were a treasure from the moment I met you, but this—" He placed a gentle hand on her stomach. "This is beyond anything I could have hoped for." Relief flooded through Grace as Vaughn pulled her into his arms, his tears mingling with hers. They stayed like that for a long while, holding each other as the fire crackled beside them, the spilled coffee forgotten. "We're going to be parents," Vaughn whispered against her hair. "A family." "Yes," Grace replied, feeling a joy so intense it almost hurt. "A family." As word spread through town, reactions ranged from genuine delight to thinly veiled skepticism. Mrs. Wilkins organized an impromptu celebration at the Silver Dollar, declaring that miracles deserved champagne. Mayor Blanchard announced a special collection to expand the school to accommodate the next generation of Ashfords, a gesture that brought tears to Grace's eyes. Not everyone was as supportive. Grace overheard whispers questioning whether she'd been truthful about her condition, or worse, whether the child was truly Vaughn's. These rumors hurt, but Vaughn's unwavering support and the backing of their closest friends helped her weather the gossip. Dr. Morris, perhaps to atone for his earlier bluntness about her condition, became her staunchest medical advocate. He publicly declared Grace's pregnancy a medical anomaly, but certainly not impossible, and warned that stress from gossip could harm both mother and child. As spring bloomed into summer, Grace's body changed, her stomach rounding with new life. Vaughn treated her like precious glass, insisting on taking over more household chores and hiring a local girl to help with laundry and cleaning. He built a cradle from cherry wood, carving intricate patterns of leaves and stars into the headboard. "For our little treasure," he explained when Grace admired his handiwork. The pregnancy progressed without complications, much to Dr. Morris's amazement. By July, Grace had reluctantly agreed to end the school term early, allowing a substitute teacher to finish the final weeks. The children presented her with a quilt they had secretly made, each square containing a message or picture for the baby. "You'll be back to teach us after the baby comes, won't you, Miss Grace?" asked Emma Foster, now 14 and helping with the younger children. "Of course," Grace assured her, though perhaps not until after Christmas. As her September due date approached, Grace found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this point. 3 years ago, she'd believed her worth diminished by what her body couldn't do. Now, cradling the miracle growing within her, she understood that her value had never depended on motherhood, but the gift of it filled her with wonder nonetheless. On a stormy August night 2 weeks earlier than expected, Grace woke to sharp pains and dampness. "Vaughn," she gasped, clutching his arm, "it's time." The birth was difficult and prolonged. Dr. Morris was summoned, along with Mrs. Wilkins and 2 other women experienced in midwifery. Vaughn paced outside until Mrs. Wilkins, exasperated by his anxiety, ordered him to boil water and make himself useful. After 18 hours of labor, as dawn broke on a new day, their daughter entered the world with a lusty cry that belied her small size. "She's perfect," Dr. Morris declared, placing the swaddled infant in Grace's exhausted arms. "Small but strong." Vaughn, allowed back into the room, approached the bed with reverence. His eyes filled with tears as he gazed upon his wife and daughter. "She has your eyes," Grace whispered, though the baby's eyes were still the unfocused blue of all newborns. "And your spirit," Vaughn replied, gently touching the wispy dark hair on their daughter's head. "What shall we name her?" They had discussed names but reached no decision, waiting to meet their child first. Now, looking at the tiny face blinking up at them, Grace knew. "Hope," she said softly. "Hope, Elizabeth Ashford." "Hope," Vaughn repeated, testing the name. "It's perfect. She is our hope, made flesh." As the women cleaned up and Dr. Morris prepared to leave, the physician paused by Grace's bedside. "Mrs. Ashford, I owe you an apology. I spoke with such certainty about your condition, never considering that medicine still has much to learn about the human body." Grace smiled tiredly. "No apology needed, doctor. You gave your best medical opinion. Sometimes life finds a way that science can't explain." Dr. Morris nodded thoughtfully. "Indeed it does. And if I may say, this child is truly a treasure." After everyone had gone, leaving the new family alone, Vaughn stretched out beside Grace on the bed, cradling both her and Hope in his strong arms. "Do you remember the first thing I ever called you?" he asked, stroking their daughter's cheek with a gentle finger. Grace thought back to that autumn day by the deer. You said I was either the most capable woman you'd ever met or the most stubborn. Vaughn chuckled. True, but later. That night when we talked by the fire, I called you my treasure. His voice grew thick with emotion. And now you've given me another treasure to cherish. Grace leaned her head against his shoulder, contentment washing through her despite her exhaustion. They said a woman couldn't bear a child, she murmured, but a cowboy called her treasure, and soon she carried his baby. The best kind of story, Vaughn whispered, pressing a kiss to her forehead. The kind with a happy ending. Not an ending, Grace corrected, watching their daughter's tiny fingers curl around Vaughn's thumb. A beginning. The years that followed proved Grace right. Hope Elizabeth grew into a strong-willed, bright child with her father's green eyes and her mother's love of books. When Hope was 2, the doctor who had once pronounced Grace barren delivered their son, Samuel Vaughn Ashford, in the middle of a spring thunderstorm. By the time Grace returned to teaching, it was in a new schoolhouse built on the edge of their expanded property, where she instructed not just her own children, but those from neighboring farms and ranches. Vaughn's partnership with the Tillman Ranch flourished, eventually allowing him to buy adjacent land and start his own breeding program for quality horses. Sometimes, when watching her family, Vaughn teaching Hope to ride her pony, Samuel toddling after chickens in the yard, Grace would remember the lonely woman who had once believed family wasn't in her future. That woman could never have imagined the joy that awaited her, or how completely love would transform her life. On their 10th wedding anniversary, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset while their children played in the yard, Vaughn took her hand. Any regrets, Mrs. Ashford? Grace shook her head, leaning against his shoulder. Not one. You called me your treasure when I felt worthless, and in doing so, you helped me find my true value. You were always valuable, Vaughn replied, squeezing her hand. I just had the good fortune to recognize it first. As twilight deepened around them, Grace silently thanked whatever twist of fate had brought a wandering cowboy to her hunting grounds on that autumn day so long ago. Some called their family a miracle, but Grace knew the real miracle was simpler. It was finding someone who saw treasure where others saw only lack, and building a life rich with love in the shadow of the mountains they now called home.